We look at the map of the Caribbean today, and we are conditioned to see a playground. We see turquoise waters, white sands, and the gentle sway of palm trees. We see a retreat from the heavy machinery of the modern world. But if you were to stand on the edge of the Atlantic 300 years ago, looking toward the horizon, you would not see a paradise. You would see the most violent, heavily militarized, and fiercely contested theater of global wealth in human history. You would see an ocean where the destiny of empires was forged, not by diplomats in powdered wigs, but by the density of ironwood, the geometry of stone fortresses, and the sheer, brutal endurance of the men who navigated the Gulf Stream. To understand the modern world, we must first return to the crucible where it was manufactured. We must return to the key to the new world. The year is 1750, and if you were to look at a map of the world, not as a collection of land masses, but as a circulatory system of wealth, power, and ambition, your eyes would inevitably be drawn to a single, narrow passage of water, the Gulf Stream. For the Spanish Empire, this warm, swift ocean current was the only reliable highway home from the Americas. And sitting perfectly at the mouth of this current, commanding the straits like a stone sentinel, was Cuba. Or, more precisely, the heavily fortified Bay of Havana. To understand the Caribbean in the 18th century, you must first strip away the modern illusions of a tropical paradise. For the men who navigated these waters, the Caribbean was an industrial and military theater. Havana was not a resort, it was the ultimate vault. It was known simply as the Llave del Nuevo Mundo, the key to the new world. Twice a year, the horizon would darken with the sails of the Flota de Indias, the Spanish treasure fleet. Dozens of massive galleons, scarred by storms and trailing seaweed, would slowly navigate the narrow channel into Havana's harbor. Deep in their wooden bellies lay the lifeblood of the Spanish crown. Silver from the mines of Potosi, gold from New Granada, emeralds and cochineal dye. For months, these ships had been vulnerable, dispersed across the treacherous waters of the Americas. But once they dropped anchor under the shadow of the Castillo de los Tres Reyes del Morro, the great fortress of El Morro, they were safe. Let us pause to consider the sheer, terrifying logistics of this journey. In the age of sail, men did not conquer the ocean, they negotiated with it. The Caribbean is dictated by the relentless engine of the Gulf Stream and the trade winds. A ship could not simply chart a straight line. The Spanish fleet was a massive, vulnerable organism. Dozens of heavily laden, slow-moving merchant galleons had to be herded by warships in perfect, disciplined formation. If a galleon lost a mast in a sudden squall and drifted out of line, it was immediately hunted by privateers. The journey from Veracruz or Cartagena was a grueling test of mathematics, wind, and endurance. Havana was the only geographical bottleneck where this colossal machine could safely reassemble, repair its battered rigging, and prepare for the final, dangerous push across the Atlantic. For the thousands of sailors, soldiers, and merchants who disembarked, Havana was a shock to the senses. The city was a paradox of extreme wealth and stoic military discipline. European aristocrats walked the sun-baked plazas in heavy brocade coats, sweating profusely to maintain the illusion of Madrid in the tropics. But the true machinery of the city was maintained by an army of indigenous laborers, free people of color, and enslaved Africans. They were the ones hauling the provisions, repairing the sails, and loading the staggering wealth of a continent into the holds of the fleet. When the fleet was in port, Havana was the richest city on the globe. When it departed, leaving the harbor eerily quiet, the city settled back into its permanent state, waiting, watching, and preparing for war. While the silver galleons captured the imagination of Europe, the true marvel of 18th century Cuba lay not in what it stored, but in what it built. By the early 1700s, the Spanish Armada was facing a quiet, rotting crisis. The oak forests of Europe were being depleted, and the wood they did harvest deteriorated rapidly in the warm, shipworm-infested waters of the Caribbean. A galleon built in Spain might last only a decade before its hull turned to sponge. The solution was found in the dense, unforgiving jungles of Cuba. Here, the Spanish discovered mahogany and ironwood, timbers so incredibly dense that a dropped log would sink straight to the bottom of a river. This wood was notoriously difficult to fell, impossible to saw with standard tools, and heavy enough to break the backs of the men forced to transport it. But once shaped, it was virtually indestructible. A hull built of Cuban mahogany did not splinter when struck by a British cannonball. It absorbed the impact. Thus, the Real Arsenal de la Havana, the Royal Shipyard, was born. Imagine standing on the docks in 1730. The air vibrates with the deafening rhythm of thousands of hammers, the rhythmic scraping of saws, and the roar of the forge. This was the largest industrial complex in the New World. It was a place of sweat, tar, and mathematical precision. The shipwrights of Havana were masters of their craft, blending European engineering with the brute strength of local materials. They were constructing leviathans. It was here that the Santissima Trinidad would eventually be born, a floating fortress of 140 guns, the most heavily armed ship to ever sail the oceans. The men who built these ships were a rough, specialized breed, living in a city that respected the geometry of a hull as much as the decrees of a king. They built the vessels that allowed Spain to maintain its grip on the world for another century. To truly understand the scale of this operation, one must look inside the hull. We are not talking about simple wooden boats. We are talking about the highest pinnacle of 18th century engineering. Consider the anatomy of a Spanish ship of the line built in Havana. The ribs and planking were crafted from solid Cuban mahogany, sometimes reaching a thickness of 2 feet. This was a deliberate, calculated defense. When a 24-pound solid iron cannonball struck a traditional European oak hull, the wood would shatter, sending lethal, jagged splinters tearing through the gun deck. But Cuban mahogany was different. It did not splinter, it absorbed the iron. Inside these dark, suffocating lower decks, hundreds of men lived shoulder to shoulder alongside massive iron cannons, livestock, and tons of stone ballast. The ships born in Havana were floating fortresses, designed to endure the worst hurricanes of the Caribbean and the heaviest broadsides of the Royal Navy. If you traveled inland, leaving the noise of the shipyards and the shadows of the fortresses behind, the landscape shifted dramatically. Before sugar completely devoured the island in the 19th century, the soul of the Cuban earth belonged to a different crop, one that required not industrial grinding, but quiet, almost meditative patience. Tobacco. In the valleys of the Vuelta Abajo, the land was worked by the Vegueros, independent tobacco farmers. Unlike the massive, brutal slave plantations that defined Jamaica or Saint-Domingue, the Cuban tobacco farm of the early 1700s was a smaller, more intimate operation. Growing premium tobacco is an art form. It requires a profound understanding of the soil, a constant reading of the wind and rain, and an obsessive attention to the curing process. The Veguero was a proud, independent man. He worked alongside his family, carefully pruning the leaves, hanging them in wooden barns, and waiting for the exact moment when the green faded into a rich, aromatic brown. These men forged a culture of self-reliance that stood in stark contrast to the rigid hierarchy of Havana. But the Spanish crown, ever desperate for revenue to fund its European wars, saw this independence as a vulnerability. In the 1700s, Madrid established the Estanco del Tabaco, a strict royal monopoly. The farmers were forced to sell their entire harvest to the crown at fixed, artificially low prices. The response was inevitable. The Vegueros rebelled. They marched on Havana, armed with machetes and muskets, demanding fair compensation for their labor. The uprisings were suppressed with cavalry and executions, but the spirit of the Veguero remained unbroken. It was the first quiet rumble of a distinct Cuban identity, a people who realized that their interests and the interests of the men sitting in the palaces of Madrid were no longer the same. The inevitable clash of empires finally arrived on the morning of June 6, 1762. The 7 Years' War was consuming the globe, and the British Empire, at the absolute zenith of its naval supremacy, decided to seize the key to the New World. Picture the horizon outside Havana turning entirely white with canvas. Lord Albemarle arrived with an armada of over 200 ships and 14,000 seasoned troops. It was the largest amphibious force ever assembled in the Americas. The Spanish defenders, looking out from the battlements of El Morro, knew that the survival of their empire hung in the balance. What followed was not a swift, glorious battle of cavalry charges. It was a grueling, horrific, and mathematically precise war of military engineering. The British understood that Havana could not be taken from the sea. The guns of El Morro were too high, the stone walls too thick. They had to land on the harsh, rocky coast and besiege the fortress from behind. For 2 months, the Caribbean sun became the greatest enemy. British engineers, clad in heavy wool uniforms, hacked trenches through solid coral rock. There was no water. Malaria and yellow fever swept through the camps, killing hundreds of men a week. Yet the siege lines crept closer, inch by bloody inch. But the true horror of this siege was not found in the exchange of artillery. It was found in the environment. The British had arrived in the dead of the Caribbean summer. Thousands of soldiers, dressed in heavy European wool uniforms designed for the battlefields of Flanders, were ordered to dig siege trenches. But the ground around Havana was not soft earth. It was solid, jagged coral rock. Every inch had to be blasted or hacked away under a blinding, unforgiving sun. Fresh water quickly ran out, and then the true defender of Cuba arrived: yellow fever. It swept through the British camps with terrifying efficiency. Men who survived the grueling labor of the trenches woke up with a burning fever, dying within days. Of the thousands of British casualties during the siege of Havana, less than 1,000 fell to Spanish muskets. Nearly 5,000 were eradicated by the mosquito and the heat. It was a brutal lesson in the realities of colonial warfare. Inside El Morro, the defense was commanded by Luis de Velasco, a Spanish naval captain of legendary resolve. Velasco refused to yield. He repaired shattered walls under heavy fire and led desperate sorties to spike British cannons. When the British finally managed to dig a mine directly under the fortress walls and detonate it, blowing a massive breach in the stone, they stormed the rubble. Velasco, standing in the breach with his sword drawn, fought until he was shot through the chest. His defense was so magnificent that the British commanders, upon his death, ordered a ceasefire to bury him with full military honors. It was a moment of profound, grim respect between men who understood the terrible cost of duty. With the fall of El Morro, Havana surrendered. For 11 months, the Union Jack flew over the greatest prize in the Americas. And in that brief window of time, the British unknowingly triggered a tectonic shift that would change Cuba forever. The Spanish had kept Havana a closed system, a monopoly restricted only to ships flying the flag of Castile. the British immediately tore those doors off their hinges. They opened the port of Havana to free global trade. Suddenly, the harbour was flooded with merchant ships from New England, London, and Jamaica. This was not a military occupation, it was a hostile corporate takeover. The British merchants brought with them two things that the Cuban elites had desperately wanted: vast amounts of capital and an industrialized approach to agriculture. During this single year, thousands of enslaved Africans were brought to the island, alongside modern iron rollers and steam-powered machinery for crushing sugarcane. The Cuban planters, who had long watched the British and French grow unimaginably wealthy on sugar in neighboring islands, suddenly had the tools and the market access to compete. Forests were rapidly cleared. The landscape began to change from the small plots of the Vegueros to the sprawling, brutal geometry of the sugar plantation. In 11 months, the British injected a century's worth of economic acceleration into the island. They woke a sleeping giant. When the diplomats finally signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763, ending the 7 Years' War, the maps were redrawn. King Charles III of Spain was so desperate to get Havana back that he traded the entire territory of Florida to the British in exchange. The Spanish military returned to Havana, marching back into El Morro, patching the stone and raising their flag once more. On the surface, it seemed as though order had been restored. But beneath the surface, the Cuba they returned to was not the Cuba they had lost. The taste of free trade and rapid industrialization could not be unlearned. The Cuban elite, having seen the staggering profits of the sugar trade, pressured the crown for permanent economic reforms. Spain, realizing they could not put the genie back in the bottle, slowly relented. As the 1700s drew to a close, Cuba began its transformation into the undisputed sugar capital of the world. The fortifications of Havana still stood, silent and imposing, but the true power of the island had shifted from the military governors to the wealthy sugar barons. The shipyards continued to hammer, but the ships they built were now primarily merchant vessels, designed to carry the sweet, dark gold of the plantations to a world addicted to sugar. Walking the cobbled streets of old Havana as the century turned, a man could feel the weight of what had transpired. The city had survived pirates, plagues, and the full might of the British Royal Navy. It had transitioned from a purely strategic garrison to a complex, brutal, and breathtakingly wealthy society. The 18th century had tested the island with fire and iron, and Cuba had emerged, not just unbroken, but forged into the very center of the Atlantic world. A place where the old codes of honor collided with the ruthless dawn of global commerce.